objective to keep global temperatures closer to an increase of 1.5 degrees and further assist parties with their efforts to address adaptation to climate change and the loss and damage associated with its impacts. For South Africa, the main priorities, as mandated by Cabinet ahead of COP26, were to secure a balanced outcome amongst the three objectives of the Paris Agreement, namely mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation for financing and technical support. Because adaptation and financing have historically been neglected, it was important to us to secure an ambitious and progressive finance and adaptation package to support African and other developing countries, as well as to complete the Paris Agreement work program. The key technical work included setting up carbon markets, an enhanced transparency framework, and agreeing on common timeframes for the nationally determined contributions of parties to the agreement. These overarching objectives have been met. Parties have agreed to work towards limiting the aggregate global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees and to align their nationally determined contributions to this objective, as South Africa has already done through the submission of our enhanced NDC ahead of COP26. In this regard, an annual mitigation ambition work program has been established, coupled with ministerial roundtables to assess progress on implementation. Parties are encouraged to review their NDCs at any time, in line with Article 4.11 of the Paris Agreement. Parties are also asked to update on a regular basis their long-term low emissions development strategy, and the UNFCCC Secretariat will provide a synthesis report on these strategies and on the NDCs on an annual basis. A 2-year work program has been agreed to operationalize the global goal on adaptation under the CMA as the governing body of the Paris Agreement. The deliberations on a new collective goal on climate finance support for developing countries have been initiated. The agenda item on long-term finance for developing countries, which was to have ended at COP26, will continue under the convention until 2027, with a specific focus on reviewing and monitoring the commitment of $100 billion per annum goal from 2021 to 2025. A platform has been set up to address both the just transition and alignment of financial flows, consistent with a pathway towards a low greenhouse gas emission future and climate resilient development. This should assist in directing finances towards the achievement of climate imperatives without compromising the other sustainable development imperatives of developing countries. After 6 years of intense and very difficult technical discussions, there is agreement on the establishment of carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This includes measures to avoid double counting and ensure environmental integrity, resolving the question of corresponding adjustments for non-NDC activities, as well as a compromise involving the transfer of limited credits from the 2013 to 2020 period into the new markets. Africa's key requirement of using markets to secure a predictable and at-scale source of funding for adaptation is partly accommodated through a voluntary share of proceeds contribution to the adaptation fund from the Article 6.2 mechanism and reporting under the enhanced transparency framework. Parties have agreed to a 5-year common timeframe for the implementation of nationally determined contributions starting in 2031. This is an effort to address the complexities of aggregating the collective impact of NDCs that are currently addressing different time periods. We have also concluded the tables for reporting action and support under the enhanced transparency framework in line with our mandate. The unresolved issue of the recognition of Africa's special needs and circumstances is kept alive for substantive discussion at the African COP27 to be hosted by Egypt in Sharm el-Sheikh next year. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister, for that insightful presentation on the outcomes of COP26. Any questions? We are ready now to take questions from members of the media. Any questions from the floor? Yes.
Hi, Kristen Engel here from the Cape Argus. I would just like to find out what is Minister Barbara Creecy's response to the protests that have been taking place while COP26 was taking place in Glasgow. And these are calls by the youth and indigenous small-scale fishing communities that their voices weren't included in the discussions at COP26.
Okay. Thank you. The next question.
Joseph Musia from SABC. Minister, my question to you is the Africa Special Needs and Circumstances issue. It's quite an important one, isn't it? South Africa, for instance, will rely on coal for a long time because we have it as an abundant resource that other more developed countries like China are still using today to advance their development at a very fast pace. What is this going to be taken into account when is this being taken into account when we negotiate and we actually make commitments about how much we're going to be reducing our emissions?
Thanks, Mr. Any further questions? Minister, you want to respond?
Thank you very much. I think that if you had been together with us at COP26, you would have seen that every day there were major demonstrations by different interest groups outside of the venue itself. And this obviously is an indication of the extent to which different communities around the globe are deeply concerned about the way in which climate change is affecting them. Obviously, the convention is a relationship between parties, sovereign states. But I think that there is a recognition that the voice of youth is particularly important because for young people, the climate crisis is the future that they will be living through for all of their adult lives. And I think that there has been recognition of this by the Secretary General, and I suppose that really it's up to the UN to decide how this voice would be formally included. From a country perspective, we made sure that 2 representatives of the Climate Commission were accredited delegates at the conference. And these 2 representatives were youth representatives of the Climate Commission. And I think that we took that perspective because we understand the extent to which this issue is a major issue for young people in our country and for young people across the globe. And we think that the supporting in the formal side events of the conference, the voice of young people is very, very important. I think similarly, there would have been a lot of representation from indigenous communities. And I think it wasn't just fishing communities, it would have been communities from rainforests, communities from different biomes around the world that would be severely impacted on by the implications of climate change. I think that the key issue is really to be looking at the question of how climate change is going to be impacting on the fishing industry in our country. Fishing is a significant economic sector. It accounts for about 28,000 formal jobs in our country, and it also accounts for more than 10,000 small-scale fishing people. And we know that already our fishing stocks are severely impacted on by climate change. And for example, sardines and small pelagics, their migration patterns have changed, and we don't fully understand why, but we do understand that this is probably as a result of the impact of climate change and the circulation of warm and cold currents within the oceans. There were 3 studies that we have done over the last year, and outside of this meeting, we can give you the link for those studies where we looked at the impact of climate change on fishing and fishing communities. And I think that we are very cognizant that this is a very serious challenge, and ultimately it's a challenge which is going to impact on the question of food security in our country. With regard to the issue of Africa's special needs and circumstances, I think that this issue has been an issue that was not included in the agreement at Paris. And it was a particular concern for the African continent, because what we understand is that if you look at the current climate crisis, the cause of that crisis is not just current emissions, it's the accumulation of carbon gas emissions over the last 2 centuries of industrialization. When we analyze the contribution of the African continent to those carbon gas emissions, what we know is that the historical contribution of our continent is 1%. And this raises the issue of climate justice and climate equity. Who is most severely impacted on by climate change? Who is having to spend billions of their budgets on adapting to the realities of climate change? Whose food security and water security is at stake? It is the security and the future of the African continent. And there were many impassioned pleas made during the course of negotiations that there cannot be climate justice if these circumstances are not recognized, and if there is not proper support that should be forthcoming from developed countries whose development has benefited from carbon gas emissions, to developing countries that are now in a position where they are facing the devastating impacts of climate change. So I think that issue of climate justice is fundamental to the question of the very strong view of the African group that there needs to be adequate support to deal with the consequences of climate change, and also with the ability to cope with the transitions that might be necessary on the continent. I think that with regard to the issue of coal, you would have seen that in the final text of the cover agreement, there is wording there that talks about the phase down of coal. There's also wording there that talks about the recognition of national circumstances and the importance of a just transition. And I think that really what that language is all about is it's about saying that for developing countries, there's a recognition of the enormous cost that transitioning economies to lower carbon growth paths and to climate resilient societies is going to have. I think that there's been an estimation by the OECD that developing countries will only require in the region of about $4 trillion US dollars over the next 15 years to achieve these transitions. And I think that text was really about saying that countries must be transitioning like our country. We have to do our fair share, but we have to be transitioning at a manner and at a pace which is determined by our national sovereign interests and by the availability of resources. We can't be signing up to a situation where we are not ensuring that we have adequate financial support for the transitions that will be taking place. You would know that there has been an offer made on the sidelines of COP26 to support South Africa's transition. While we think that is a good first step, in the context of what is required financially for South Africa to transition, it's a very small first step. And I think that it's very important that developing countries should maintain a fundamental principle, which is in the Paris Agreement itself. And that is a principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which talks to this issue of who is responsible historically for carbon emissions and national circumstances and capacities, which talks about what it would take to achieve these transitions in developing countries.
Thanks, Minister. Some of the questions that are coming via online platforms. Terence Creamer from Engineering News asks Minister, what's that? While I get that, let me pick up Norma Burani from the SABC. Norma asks, there's been talk that Africa could leapfrog and be the leader in implementing fully functional green economies as the Africa group of negotiators. Did you speak about this and what capacity would we need as a continent or as South Africa to actually lead the way away from grey economies?
Yes, I think that we have regular meetings in a forum that is called ASEM, the African Ministers of the Environment. And there were a lot of discussions there about these issues of Africa's special circumstances. But there was also recognition in this forum about the important opportunities that a transition represents. Obviously, on the African continent as a whole, there is a major issue of energy poverty. And that energy poverty obviously provides an opportunity for the African continent to invest in new forms of technology, green technology. There are lots of opportunities around hydropower, opportunities around wind and solar. So there is an appetite on the continent for these investments. The issue is whether these investments can be secured at a pace that is affordable for the countries concerned and also at a pace which meets their development needs.
Minister Barbara Creecy has just come back from COP26 and giving us updates there. We'll continue to dip in and out of that briefing.